welcome to Solosaurus, a podcast about one-player board and card games. My name is Brandon Waite.
My name is Carter Mackey.
And this is episode number 9, where we're going to talk about HEXplore It, the Valley of the Dead King, which wins the award for the dry erasiest hex-obsessed board game that I have played this year. And God help me, I do love a good hex and dry erase marker set.
Yeah, hexes are really satisfying. This is probably my first dry erase experience, though.
Oh, yeah. But it is nice having the dry erase markers in here. We will talk about that more in just a little bit, though. But first, we're going to get to the news. The first bit of news for this week is that WizKids has announced Dungeons & Dragons 2018 Adventure System board game, which is available for pre-order if you want to pre-order a game that is named that. Yeah, that's not the final name, obviously. It's just that they seem to not want to reveal what the game theme is actually going to be about. 1 to 5 players, designed by Kevin Wilson, who's one of the kings of Ameritrash games. Cooperative game. And that's about all we know about it. I mean, it stands to reason that it's going to be another one of those dungeon crawl type games in the same vein as The Wrath of Ashardalon and Castle Ravenloft, and some of the other adventure type system games they've had come out for the last few years that you can mix together, and it'll probably be one of those. But why wouldn't you just go ahead and announce the name of the game if you're going to open pre-orders?
Like, how far away is it going to come out?
I don't know. I mean, I presume it's going to come out sometime this summer, but I didn't see a release date on this story. Maybe I missed it, and if I did, one of you all can email in and let me know, but it feels odd to me that they're not revealing the name or the theme of this game before they open pre-orders for it.
Maybe they're just doing like the EA Sports thing, and they'll just come out with one every year.
Oh, that'd be perfect.
Yeah.
And then whoever's on the cover that year is cursed.
That's right.
Yeah, the Beholder's going to have a really bad year in 2018. All right, so the second piece of news for today is that Lucky Duck Games has announced Jetpack Joyride, the board game, designed by Michael Golubielski. That's my best guess, folks. It has 1 to 4 players on the box. It's a real-time polyomino type game based on that famous iPhone game by the same name. So the pieces for this actually look pretty cool. They look like sort of translucent plastic versions of the polyomino pieces that you find in a game like Patchwork or Feast for Odin or something like that. Not 100% sure how that works into the mechanics of playing a game that plays like Jetpack Joyride does on the iPhone. Also, I didn't know that anybody was asking for this, but it does play 1 to 4 players, and because this is such a popular mobile game, this might be something you want to keep on your radar. And the final piece of news for today, because again, we are in the slow news season before we hit the big summer conventions, is that Stronghold Games has announced Spring Meadow from Uwe Rosenberg that plays 1 to 4 players. Players compete to earn hiking pins, right? And this might actually have the best description ever for a game. Choose your route carefully. Watch out for the burrows of the marmots and pack enough snacks. Your chances to earn an Edelweiss hiking pin are rather low if you sit hungry in the snow.
Okay.
That's it.
Yep,
that's it. This is the third in a trilogy of games from Uwe Rosenberg that started with Cottage Garden a couple of years ago, and then went to Indian Summer last year, and now Spring Meadow. So they're all pretty basic polyomino games. He's on a real kick with that recently. This time, it looks like instead of a 4x4 grid that you pick pieces from, which I believe is how Cottage Garden works, this is a 5x5 grid, so you can see a little bit further ahead, maybe that there's more strategy involved in what pieces you pick, that sort of thing. I don't know, I haven't actually played any of these games yet. I am interested in them a great deal. Once I fight past the description of the game that the publisher puts out, they just don't make them sound that good.
I'm still just waiting for his game to come out where the theme is about running like an industrial factory, you know?
Oh, that's coming.
Yeah.
And then once he does it, he'll announce a trilogy of games about industrial factories, because he can't do a thing without doing 3 to 4 games of the same kind.
Right. I'm just saying, though, like a game where he's like, you're like exploiting the environment and destroying, you know, all of the like bucolic places in the world
that you helped to build with all the games up to this point.
Right.
That's all the solo games news we have for you this week. Hopefully we'll get some more news coming in the next few months as we begin to head into convention season. Origins is only a few weeks away, and then of course Gen Con is in August, and that's when we'll really start to see the announcements ramp up. But until that time, we're just going to go ahead and head into our review for this episode, which is for HEXplore It. HEXplore It, The Valley of the Dead King, was originally a Kickstarter game, went on Kickstarter in 2017, and made $118,000 from designer Jonathan Mariucci. It plays 1 to 7 players, and this is a cooperative overworld type adventure game where you're going to be completing quests and leveling up characters and trying to get your party strong enough to defeat the Dead King, who is in this valley and apparently has been for a long time, but is just now starting to cause some trouble. He starts the game off the board as you and your adventurers begin to level up, and then eventually he comes onto the main adventure board and starts slowly destroying cities. Your goal is to defeat the Dead King before he destroys all the cities on the board. And that's it. When you're playing solo in this game, you play with either one character with just a very few minor rules adjustments, or you can play multiple characters at the same time, just managing each of them separately if you prefer more interaction between characters. So we're going to just get right into the components of this game, and I think these are pretty good, right?
Yeah, they're solid, definitely. From, I would say, the quality of the tiles and the 2 little figures. I mean, that's all that you have, but they're still, I feel like, well made, and then just the dice and how hefty they are.
Yeah, the dice are really nice quality. The cards are good. They're not, super heavy or linen finished or anything like that, but they're nice.
Yeah, they get the job done.
And they look good. The graphic design, for the most part, on the cards and everything, I feel like is clear for the cards and the main board. It looks really nice. And then in this game, one of the things that makes it unique is that in addition to those components, that you have these interlocking hex grid type things that make up the main map. And then you have a couple of pieces attached to those that give you places to put your cards. That's pretty standard fare.
Right.
But in addition, you also have your player board. And unlike other player boards in these type of games, these are actually dry erase boards. And so you're going to be keeping track of your stats over the course of the game with some dry erase markers that come in the box that have a little eraser attached to the tip of them, just like using a pencil. So you keep track of all your character stats on these. And those boards are nice and thick. I really dig the idea of keeping track of your character's stats with dry erase markers. It seems to streamline a lot of things right out of the box.
Yeah, and like you said, they're the boards that, have all of your information are like a good heft and weight to them.
Yeah. So the components for the game, I would say, are good. They're not going to blow you away, right? The miniatures are Reaper Bones miniatures, I believe, or at least they're from that same family of miniatures. Mm-hmm. And I've always thought that Reaper miniatures look kind of muddy. I don't know anything about miniatures, but they're not super detailed. They don't look great.
Right.
These look fine. There's only 2 of them in the box, so it's easy to manage, right? But yeah. It's fine. The rulebook is not so great, though.
Yeah, I didn't like the rulebook.
I thought the rulebook was okay, but Carter and I had 2 different experiences. I actually, in preparation for this game, I watched a playthrough of sort of the introductory scenario just so I could get a feel for what the game is going to be like before I got into the rules. And so I ended up feeling like the rules were okay, relatively easy to get through.
Yes.
And I didn't have too many questions when I went back to the rules. But you didn't have that experience.
So I just read the rules, and reading through them was fine. Nothing came off as weird or confusing while reading the rules. But I found myself constantly checking back through the rule book and all these little placards that they include with other rules. It was a lot of times when I was trying to find something or verify to make sure I was doing something correctly, I didn't really know where to look. Not all the information would be where you expect it. Information was split up in strange places. Some of the tiles are mountains or water, and you can't move over those tiles. But reading the rule book, you'll never know that. It's actually on the placard that is the marketplace of items you can buy in the city. It lists items like climbing gear or foldable boat, and that tells you that you can't use those tiles unless you have these items, which is a strange, I I guess, omission to explain how movement works going across the land. I feel very confident that I probably played this game wrong in like a couple of ways because I just gave it my best go about some things because some things were not quite as intuitive and I wasn't really sure. And sometimes I would look things up and I could find answers, and sometimes I really didn't find what I was wondering about addressed. So it just made me not confident that I was playing the game correctly, I guess.
For the most part, I didn't have that experience. I mean, I felt like because I watched this video, I definitely had a leg up. And so maybe some of the things that would have been gaps for me if I had just read the rule book, I didn't have issues with because I had already watched somebody else playing the game. Now, whether or not that person was playing correctly, who knows, right? But the area that I tended to have questions about was the combat, which is a pretty significant area of the game to have a question about. And I didn't feel like that section was very well fleshed out at all.
That's the one I'm mainly thinking of that I kept coming back to.
Yeah.
And obviously it went better like after I got through this, like the first game. But yeah, it was, I just didn't know what I was doing. I felt like the whole, like for that first like combat.
It's similar to the experience I think that we had with Maximum Apocalypse, which is, this is a pretty easy rulebook to get through your first time reading. Like you read it and you think, okay, I can get into this, right? It's 60 pages, this rulebook, but it's a weird format for a rulebook. It's like a third the size of a sheet of paper.
Right.
So you just blow right through this 60 pages. It's no problem at all.
Pretty large text on top of that.
Yeah, large text. And I know a lot of people love rulebooks. I never have. I don't enjoy reading rulebooks at all. I would wish I could just retain all the rules in my head and just know how to play a game instantly. So I don't enjoy that process. For me, this wasn't bad until I actually got into the meat of the game and needed to look up a couple of things here and there, even more so for you.
Yeah.
Rules are definitely need some improvement, need some filling out. And that then leads us into the actual play of the game. And this game is obviously trying to build on the sorts of systems that were put in place years ago with these sort of overworld adventure tabletop games. Everything from the art direction to the way that travel is handled feels very similar to a game like Barbarian Prince or something like that. It's definitely meant to evoke some of those older games. And what you're going to be doing in this game is you, at the beginning, are going to combine a race board with a class board, right? Which each of them has their own separate sort of bonuses and things on the boards. And because you can combine any race with any class, there's a ton of replayability right there. Picking those two things alone gets you a pretty unique start in the game.
Right. One thing, though, I kind of wondered about playing through it is, I mean, I could see like experimenting for a while, but I feel like eventually I would find a combination that just works really well or like too well, and it would almost be, it would make certain types of experimentation, like, I don't know, just not worth it. It would just discourage it for me.
Like you're choosing to handicap yourself if you don't take one of
right.
these. Yeah.
Like once you kind of understand the systems better, like why would I choose this race with this? And so it's like really like the way to optimally play like a certain class. Because a race ultimately comes down to a couple of stat bonuses and like one special ability, which is going to be kind of meh in my opinion. Yeah,
I would say that's true. And the stats that you have, I mean, there are relatively few. You have basically like 3 different attack stats and a defense stat.
Right.
Right. And then those are sort of your combat-oriented stats. And then you also have 3 stats down at the bottom of your player board, one of which determines how well you move across the map in the game. Basically, how well you can move without getting lost in the process of moving. How much gold you find as you're moving around the country. That's another stat. And then the other one is how much food you're able to scavenge while you're traveling around. So these are the main pieces that you're working with in this game. And so the race that you pick and the class you pick, they affect those things. But then they also give you special abilities. Like sometimes in these types of adventure games, if you roll an attack, you just are rolling dice and you have sort of a generic combat move, right? Like everybody has the same sort of generic hit. In this game, all of your characters or classes, I guess, abilities are very different from one another.
Yes.
So the different attacks you have feel very different. And that is a good thing. And so it does mean that those character choices you make at the beginning are interesting, I think. But once you've made a few basic character decisions and you get your stats formed on your board, you write in on your board the values of your different stats. And what those values mean is essentially during the course of the game, you're going to be traveling around the map, trying to fulfill quests and overcome different obstacles or seek out treasures or that sort of thing to get stronger so that ultimately you can face off against the Dead King, who's crazy powerful, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to just go rush and beat him right from the beginning. As you go around the map, you're going to be using these different numbers to pass tests. And so the way that works is, let's say I go to a spot on the map that has a quest, and the goal of that quest is I need to get 1 success with my yellow die stat. And so what that means is I go to that spot, I roll my yellow D10, and I look at the number on my mat. And if I roll that number or lower, I'm successful.
Right.
Now, I know that randomization is rampant in these sorts of games, right? Rolling dice, rolling buckets of dice is very closely associated with these kind of overworld adventure, dungeon crawl type games. This game has more random dice throws than almost any game I can think of.
In like very unnecessary places, at least to me, seemingly unnecessary places.
Man, I do not understand some of these choices. So like I mentioned that you have one stat that controls how well you scavenge food, right? So the beginning of the game, you start with some food in your supply. And at the end of every turn, you need to roll this die to see if you find food that turn, if you're able to scavenge something from the woods. If you don't find it, you have to dig into your food stores. And basically, at the beginning of the game, you have enough food to last you 3 turns. If you're not scavenging food before then or getting money to buy more food, you're screwed.
Yep.
And at the beginning of the game, your food stat is going to be really low. So like often, if you're not rolling a 1 or a 2, maybe a 1, 2, or 3 on your food roll, then you're digging into your food stores. And man, that feels so oppressive to me in this game.
I mean, maybe this is playing this game just not well and inefficiently, but I found whenever I was starting off, almost all of my characters bumped their survival stat, which scavenges for food, up by 2 levels with the starting money, just because it just feels so bad to have to worry about that.
Yeah, exactly. You do start out the game with some money, and you have the option to buy these different items that can make your character more powerful or your whole party more powerful. And that's great, but you also have the ability to buy stat bumps, and you pretty much have to bump this particular stat if you're going to win, which feels like for a game that looks very open-ended when you first set it up on the table, it sort of feels like the whole world is set before you and you're going to have this great quest. It feels like if I don't bump this one particular stat, I'm going to lose.
Yeah.
Like within the first 5 rounds, probably.
Because I'm just going to have to worry so much about like having enough food, going back to towns to get food. I don't know. It's just not fun. And like, I mean, I guess I could almost understand it more if the game was more focused on like overland travel and like surviving and the hazards of that. But that's not really what the game is about.
No, and the survival aspect of it kind of detracts from the feeling of adventuring and trying to get more powerful to defeat the king.
Absolutely.
Even the way that quests are carried out then don't feel that epic, right? Because you're like on the brink of death often because you're trying to scrounge together enough food to get your party from place to place. And then you get to a location on the map where there's a quest, right? And you get to that spot, and almost always with these quests, it's either defeat a monster or it's go to this location and try to roll a success with this stat. Roll your yellow die and see if you get a success. And man, I cannot tell you how many times in this game I went to that spot and I rolled the die and I didn't roll a 1, 2, or 3 like I needed to. I rolled a 4. And because I rolled a 4, that means my turn was spent trying to take care of this quest, and because I didn't get it, now I need to try to scavenge for food so that I can stay here another round and try to roll my die again to beat the quest. But every time I have to stick around in this spot to scavenge for food, I'm probably going to fail that die roll, and then I'll be closer to death. Man, it just feels like you get hosed by the dice so very much in this game. And I don't mind some randomization, but this is over the top.
Right. I mean, I in general, I enjoy randomization. Games with lots of die roll. I mean, I'm thinking about, even just, playing regular D&D, where you can really get hosed by the dice. But there's still there's enough rolls that have small cumulative effects to where it kind of mitigates, some of this. And it's just, we only have a couple of turns in the wilderness before you start starving and suffering these awful penalties. It's just very little margin. And so I feel like a good chunk of the game, those skills are a high score is 3 to 4. And so that's a 30 to 40% chance that you'll get what you need for some of those things. That's a low enough percentage where you're very easily going to keep missing over and over again.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And these stat tests are not the only area of the game where you're going to just be rolling a die. One of the other areas that has way too much randomization, and for reasons that I don't really understand, is that at the beginning of the game, the dead king that you're trying to fight, it doesn't actually start on the board. You have to roll a die at the beginning on the first several turns to see if he comes out. And, as each round progresses, there's a greater and greater chance that he will come out. But I found that because you're just rolling a die to see how long it is before he comes out, some games he comes out the first turn. Sometimes it takes 6 rounds before he actually comes out. So that doesn't feel very good at all to me. I really hate that the game length as a whole is determined randomly by what happens at the beginning of the game as far as how long it takes him to come out. Plus, he might be traveling from city to city after he comes out. He may be traveling across the whole map to get to the next city, or maybe to one that's closer to him. All that's determined randomly as well. So the end of that then is the game length is way too variable for me. It's way too determined by the roll of the die in a way that I find unsatisfying.
Right. There's something about if you have a deck driven game where it's the game end is in the bottom 5 cards. Where it's I don't know exactly where it's going to end, but the game length is pretty established. Where this, it's more random than that.
And I don't like that because not only because I dislike that amount of luck in games, period, but also because when I sit down to play a game, for very practical reasons, I want to have a pretty good idea of how long it's going to take me to play it. Right? I mean, I don't have all the time in the world. I really disliked that I didn't have a pretty good idea of how long this was going to take because of that.
Right.
And that's such a shame because there's another area of this game where they do a wonderful job, I feel like, mitigating the luck that's present in the game. So at the top of the board, there's this row of cards that are different sort of events that might happen, enemies that you might have to fight, or different treasures you might stumble across. And you can see that there are, 4 or 5 of them turned up?
5 of them total.
There are 5 of them turned up that you can see at the beginning of your turn. And that's an interesting decision because that means you have a pretty good idea of the threats and possibilities that are out there for you. And sometimes, because those are just pulled right off the top of a deck that has all the different enemy types there are in that one deck, sometimes that means that there are some enemies out that are super powerful that will just wipe the floor with you.
Right.
And other enemies that are definitely you could take and then that you could use that to level up a little bit.
Right.
The way this game handles those cards is at the end of your turn, you're going to have to draw one of those event cards and deal with it. But on your turn, when you move around the map, you have the choice to either move cautiously, move normally, or move sort of recklessly. And if you choose to move normally or move recklessly, that's pretty bad for you because you may move a little bit further on the map during your turn, but you have a random chance to wander into another hex. right? Which, to make a long story short, we don't love the wander mechanic.
Right.
Right? It's not fun. It can end up putting you in places you don't want to be, right? But that's not the point of this little aside. What I really like about this choice that it gives you is if you choose to move cautiously, you move fewer spaces on your turn, but at the end of your turn, when you roll a die to see which of these events at the top of the board you have to face, if you've moved cautiously, you can choose not to engage that thing that you've drawn, and you can instead discard it from that little tableau at the top.
Right.
That's great. That's a wonderful idea, because then if there's a threat out there that could just wipe the floor with you, you can choose to be a little extra cautious and bide your time until you can discard it from that top row.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah. It's just because it's more control. It's more push your luck. Do you want to go for it? Do you need to take risky behavior? Do you just want to take the risk? You're just not getting hosed. You still have options.
This is something that I wish they could have somehow worked into other areas of the game too, right? Because there were too many turns on this game where I just spent in a quest space rolling a die over and over and over again, turn to turn, hoping that I beat this quest. I just wish there was some small way to mitigate that kind of roll. I know that dice rolling is a key part of the RPG kind of experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in an RPG, you have the freedom to choose to approach a situation from any angle you can imagine.
Right.
A board game doesn't allow you that.
Right.
And so you're taking, for me, what is the worst part of playing an RPG, which is just random die rolls, and stripping out the kind of creativity that surrounds it that makes those die rolls okay. And so what you're left is just the worst of all possible worlds here.
Right.
I wish more of these kind of games could take a lesson from people like Stefan Feld, which, that's not a comparison that's probably made every day, right? And I get that Stefan Feld's games are not very thematic, but he does a great job of incorporating dice in his games and then giving you opportunities to choose to mitigate those dice. Maybe you do less on one turn, like in Castles of Burgundy, for instance. You can choose not to take an action and then get some tokens that let you add or subtract one from your roll on future turns. Something like that would be so welcome here, because you need a little something like that, which is in place with dealing with that top row of cards to handle everything else. So, I don't know, it makes the stat test roll sting that much more when they came up with a really creative and cool way to handle what's going on at the top of the board.
Yeah, and like you were saying, whenever you're trying to complete a quest and you're just having to camp out and you're just rolling dice, not getting the results, and so you just do nothing and you just sit there, and you just might have to do that a couple of rounds in a row.
That doesn't feel good.
No.
This is supposed to be a game that makes you feel like you're on an adventure, and often you don't feel that way, right? At no point in playing this game did I really feel like I was adventuring. That's a problem.
Right.
Now, that said, there are some other things I really like about this game. One of the things I like is, yes, it is very difficult to complete a quest in the beginning of the game because your stats are so low and you're just going to end up failing a lot of your rolls. But once you do complete your first quest or you beat your first enemy and you start to be able to draw these power cards that are in the game, the rewards you get for completing these quests ramp up your character's strength like crazy. Yeah,
it's huge upgrades very fast.
Yeah, and that part feels really cool. I don't like that it's such an oppressive start, but once you overcome that, then things escalate really quickly. And that sense of progression is wonderful. I wish that we could have maybe slowed down that progression a little bit in order to have just a less crappy start.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Upgrades feel good in general. And so I feel like, as long as that progression is still happening, because I feel like once you get rolling, they keep coming at a pretty good clip. And so, I'd rather just start off a little bit more powerful and have those upgrades be just a little bit more modest. And I think it would just be like a smoother experience overall.
I think so too. Once you get these upgrades, you want to put them to work, right? And one of the best ways to put your upgrades to work is to go and fight a thing.
Right.
And this is where the game falls down again for me. The game comes with a battle mat that lets you track, how battles are going to take place. And the way battles work essentially is, on your character mat, you have a basic attack, a defense stat, and then 2 sort of special attacks. Your basic attack doesn't require anything of you except you use it and it does some damage. Not very much, but it'll do some. Your special attacks, you can spend a little bit of energy, which is different from your health, to pull off this bigger attack. Once you start to level up, those can be really powerful and can really start to make quick work of enemies. That's all pretty cool. I like how that stuff works. But combat itself just feels really fiddly.
Yep.
Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah. And they give you a battle mat. It's not really clear how to use it. It has some kind of sections denoted for helping keep track of some things, but it's almost distracting in a way of, I don't know. It's almost like it'd just be better if it was just maybe just a big white square in the middle that you could just manage on your own.
Yeah, because they do cover the battle mat in the rules, but it tells you a few things about how to use it, but it definitely doesn't cover everything that's on the battle mat.
Right. Or just give you an example of how to run a battle using it.
Yeah, that would have been really helpful.
Right.
And so you end up just trying to create your own kind of system for how you manage battles on this template that you've been given, like you said, in a way that would have just been easier with a big white space. And battles don't really feel like fights. I don't like rolling dice to just resolve a battle.
Right.
This isn't really like that. I mean, battle's a little bit more deterministic, right?
I mean, almost completely. I think the only randomness is what attack that the enemy will make.
And I don't mind that at all. That
Right.
system's actually really nice and pretty streamlined.
Yes.
This is a game of some pretty weird juxtapositions. Everything else in the game is super random. The combat is not, which I'm grateful for.
Right.
But then the combat just feels like math the game.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and just comparing it to some other deterministic games, with combat, this deterministic, City of Kings, it didn't feel...
What combat ends up boiling down to is me writing my health and the enemy's health at the top of the mat, and then you write down what your characters do damage-wise to this character, and then if it's not enough, then you scratch out the enemy's original health, put in its new depleted health number, and then you repeat the process. And at the end of battle, your battle mat just looks like a bunch of numbers that were scratched out, and I don't know. I mean, I realize mechanically that's how it has to work, but I guess I just never felt a sense of tension or epicness in the battle.
I think, just as you're kind of talking about it, I mean, I think the difference for me is I'm okay with deterministic combat, but if you're going to do that, there needs to be more tension with making meaningful decisions. And it was always very straightforward with what choices I was going to make.
That's true. Like when you think about the City of Kings, what direction you're going to approach an enemy from and how your other character is going to support you is very important.
Right.
And those decisions are important. In this game, your main decision is looking at an enemy's card and thinking, do I think I'm powerful enough to fight this? And really, if you'll just do a little math in your head, you can probably figure that out before you ever go in.
Right.
And it just feels like your main decision is, do I go fight it or not?
Right. Because, and also, you've already, it makes this attack after you've decided what type of attack you're going to do, whether you're going to defend, use a special ability, or whatever. So you don't even get to, make a meaningful choice in response to what the creature's doing.
Overall, then, the combat doesn't feel great, and those are the main elements of the game, is completing quests, traveling around the map, and fighting things. That's pretty much the entire game, right?
Right.
And not much of that feels great to us. There are a couple of other small things I would say about play that I do like. You do have, even though you might have multiple characters playing one game, you only have one figure that represents your party on the board. And I know that sounds like a small thing, but that does feel like a very streamlined way to handle movement on the overworld map. I really like that system. I like that there are only 2 miniatures in this game. That means that setting up and tearing down the game, really easy.
Yes.
It takes no time at all to get into it and get it going. I really like that. And that part's great. And the fact that there are these dry erase boards definitely does mean that you're cutting out a lot of setup time there too, because you don't have to deal with chits and tokens if something comes up or you have a condition that you need to take on. You just write it down. That's all there is. But Carter and I were having a conversation earlier about the dry erase boards and how that affects play and affects the development of the game. In many ways, it does streamline the experience. But in some ways, it feels like it hides what really needs more streamlining mechanically, simply because you have fewer pieces. And at the end of the day, what this game needed was to cut out several pretty key things, I think. In addition to figuring out how to manage the luck, you need to figure out how to get rid of the food mechanic and scrounging around trying to find that sort of thing. And it doesn't feel like it needs to be cut out because managing it on your board doesn't take much. But over time, because a lot of this bloat is still there, what the game ends up feeling like is not really an adventure and more like just bookkeeping.
Yeah, and the two different ways you can play solo. Playing this game solo, I can't imagine playing it with only one character. And so to me, it's almost like the default is playing it with two different characters, which means you're doing bookkeeping for two different characters. And you're constantly having to go back and forth between the sheets, rolling the die. Okay, this one was able to scrounge for food. Okay, this one wasn't. Okay, it has a food rating of 3, so I take 3 food off from his supplies, but the other one would only have taken 1 off. And it's just this little, like, going back and forth, like having, and also like every single stat or like vitality section can be upgraded. And so you're marking all of that on your board in addition to like just what those numbers are. And when you're just one person kind of having to move and do everything, I found myself kind of rubbing up against the mats more than I expected accidentally. And there was only one time this happened where I just at some point completely erased one of the numbers on my board.
Oh yeah, I did that a couple of times where I wasn't paying attention and my arm just swept across it and I didn't completely erase it, but I looked down and there's, black ink on my arm and my stuff's all smudged up. So it does work well for the most part, but that is a problem. And yeah, I tried playing this game with one character. It didn't feel very good at all, and I didn't last very long. Right. Now, part of that's probably because I'm just bad at this game, and I'm sure that people out there who really like it could tell me things that I could do better to be better at the game, right? But I felt like you really need to have two characters in order to have a more dynamic experience, because the characters that are in the box are labeled, like a brute type character or a support character or a healer or whatever. And anybody who's played a role-playing adventure knows you don't just take a support type character as your only character out into a game. You're just asking to get beat, right?
Right.
So the solo element has very limited replayability in spite of all the different races and classes in the box if you're only willing to play with one character. So you really need to play with two, but then, again, it's just too much bookkeeping.
Right. And as far as like accidentally erasing things on the dry erase board, I feel like that would be less of a problem if you were actually playing with other people, because it's a little bit spread around. You're not having to be the only person controlling everything. Right. And so I just feel like it would be less chance of you kind of messing up. And that sounds like, I guess that's nitpicky to some degree, but I don't know. It was just a real thing I had to be very aware of, I feel like, the whole time.
Yeah, it does affect the play experience. It's not a huge deal, but it is a thing that you have to be mindful of. So the play of the game is a little bit lackluster for us. Now, I will say, as far as the replayability is concerned, if you like the game and you think this sounds cool to you, man, the replayability of this game is off the charts if you're willing to play with more than one character. Because there are a ton of characters that come in this box and a ton of races. And the fact that you combine any race with any class is crazy to me.
Yes.
They do feel very different.
Right. Yeah, all the races don't feel super significant. They're different, like with their powers, but the classes can feel how their abilities work and how they're able to do things I feel like pretty different, especially the more the utility direction you go. Yeah.
And you really need to play to your character's strengths if you're going to be successful in this game. And so,
right.
That leads to all kinds of different play styles. Plus, because the maps are made up of these hex tiles that are put out in different patterns and arrangements. You can put out a totally random map if you really want to, but the game does come with a whole bunch of like map setups that the designers know work well.
Right. Well, I mean, and it's not, there's hex tiles to explore, but like the 4 base quadrants that you start the game with are these kind of irregular, not really L-shaped, but kind of in a way.
Yeah.
Tiles that fit together. And it gives you ways that you can fit those together. It comes with a couple of little small pieces that are just like 4 little hexes or 3 hexes or, things like that, where you can configure it in all sorts of different, like, interesting shapes. Seem meaningful and good.
Yeah, I think that part is fantastic. The idea of having that in the box already is great, because this is a game that map tile arrangement actually matters, right? Because movement is such a big deal in this game. That makes a huge difference on the play experience. So for me, this game gets crazy high marks for the amount of thought that went into making everything replayable. Plus, all the cards in the game feel pretty different and interesting.
They're large decks, too.
They're very large decks. So, I mean, there's a ton of variability there. Plus, this isn't a thing that I like, but whenever you have a game that has this many die rolls, too, that also introduces wild variance in the replayability as well. So, all that's something to keep in mind, especially if you don't mind that amount of randomness. So that brings us to the part of the review where we take a look at what's good about the game, what's bad, and what we think is just plain ugly. And in this review, I do have fewer good things to say about the game, but there are still some that are there. First of all, I think the components are pretty good. I'm happy with the components and the amount of stuff you get in the box, especially.
Yeah.
At retail, I think this game goes for about $65. And because they don't have a ton of miniatures in the game, you're sort of reminded about how much game you can get for that amount of money when you don't put a bunch of plastic in the box.
Right, yeah.
I mean, if you like what this game has to offer, it's a great deal.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth $60 if, like, for component and just, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and having the markers in the box and all the boards and everything, the different races, it's good. And the components are quality. I really like the idea of the dry erase system. This is probably going to be a positive and a negative for me, but overall, it's a positive. I like the idea of not having a million chits to keep up with, and having quick setup and tear down with the dry erase board. That's really nice. And I love that leveling up feels great.
Yes.
When you level up, you get so powerful so fast. That's a really great experience. And I like dealing with the mitigation of luck that happens with that top row of cards. All that for me is good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, the replayability here is the fact that it's off the charts is definitely a good thing for me.
The way the map can be reconfigured and like it has those kind of pre-made sets where it's not just something like, this is maybe a weird example, but something like Eclipse where like the random tiles you add can go off in weird directions that aren't necessarily interesting. They're just the way you chose to explore. Where this is more of like interesting shapes that I guess make a big difference with movement.
I think that's true. All of that together, I think, makes for a very replayable package and one that's interesting from game to game whenever you do take care of that variable setup. I mean, I really like all that about the game. But primarily, for me, this is a game made up of a lot of bad and ugly things.
Yeah.
So, a couple of bad things about the game first. First of all, a minor thing, like we said, the dry erase boards are good and bad. I didn't enjoy the experience of running my arm across those things and starting to erase some of my stats.
Yeah, I feel like, and for me, it's great in how it eliminates like little chits and tokens and whatnot. It seems so like kind of just bookkeeping with all the little things that you're like marking. I don't know. It was just like a little too much for me.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. And it's also exacerbated by the fact that you really do need to play multiple characters if you're going to get the most out of this game. I'm getting to the point where I'm becoming a little more tolerant of playing multiple characters at a time, but I never enjoy it.
Right.
That's why, in my mind, this is a game that's comparable to some degree to Mage Knight because it's supposed to give you a similar kind of feeling. I mean, mechanically, they're very different. Right. But one of the things I've always appreciated about Mage Knight is that you can play one character And that's plenty of bookkeeping on its own, but it gives you a totally satisfying experience with one. I felt like I was going to get that here, and I was disappointed to find that I don't. So that was a bit of a bummer. Also, for me, the game just doesn't feel like an adventure. It's not really memorable. It doesn't create memorable moments for me in a way that really sucks me into the experience. And man, that's the whole point of playing these kind of games. For me, if I want to engage the mechanics of a game at a really deep level and really grind that out, I'll go to a Stefan Feld game. But when I want to get sucked into a world, this is the kind of game you come to more often than not. And so when I don't, it's just hard for me to recommend. I would consider that not an ugly thing about the game, but certainly a bad thing about the game.
Right. And I can see where it's like plenty of thing for some people, or other people could get into it more, but it was pretty similar experience for me. I think it maybe has partially to do with kind of the randomness of how it kind of took me out. Like I couldn't really focus on, I guess, the story or get in the adventure because I'm just so concentrated on like what's going to happen and just trying to deal with randomness.
Yeah, I almost think if they put in some more ways to mitigate the die rolls, got rid of the food system and like the survival-y type aspect of the game, and did a few little things like that, that would go a long way toward making me like it a little bit more and sucking me into the theme ultimately.
Right.
But because that's not there, it just doesn't feel great for me. But there are also some things for this game that are just ugly for me. And my main complaint about the game is that it's just too random. And it affects everything from how successful you feel as an adventurer to how long it actually is to sit down and play the game. I just don't like the randomness. I don't mind it in other games as long as there's something I can do to give me more of a sense of agency that I just don't feel like I have in this game.
It just makes it feel more arbitrary, just like what's happening. Because yeah, even like how random games like Eldritch Horror or
Mansions of Madness even, right?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think. Mansions of Madness, like things can be cruel in that game, but somehow it just like adds to the theme of it, and just like the cruel, unfeeling, alien beings trying to rip your mind apart. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, and there's enough dice rolls, and you can there's some like built-in mechanics to mitigate it. I don't know.
Yeah, even as simple, something as simple in those games as having the clue tokens that you can spend to have a reroll or something like that.
Right.
Unless you get an item that would allow that sort of thing in here, you don't have that option. It's just you roll the die and whatever it gives you, it gives you. And when it goes well for you, then great. But the rest of the time, it feels terrible.
Right.
So it's just too random. And that's my primary complaint with this game. Also, though, it's too fiddly. It felt the whole time like you're just sort of keeping track of things on your board in a way that feels too bookkeepy. And also, again, detracts you from getting sucked into that theme the way you really want to.
Right.
And then also the rules were a problem.
Yeah, I think more so for me than you. But yeah, I spent a lot of extra time just second guessing myself because I couldn't, I guess, get the clarity I wanted.
And those three things together make for a pretty unsatisfying experience. So, as you could probably guess, we're not going to be giving this game our stamp of approval. I mean, obviously, a lot of people like this game. I've seen a lot of positive comments about it. People who backed it on Kickstarter seem to be really enjoying it. We're just not.
I can see where people would enjoy this game, but I'm not, I guess, I don't know entirely what compensates for these like things that we don't enjoy, or what in us like that this, like, I guess they grind worse for us.
I almost feel like if you're willing to approach a game and be willing to totally be taken for a ride, like you're just on board to see how things play out, and you don't really mind that much if you have a sense of agency in the game, then maybe this is for you. Maybe you don't mind bookkeeping. I don't know. I do have a hard time imagining the person who likes this game or what they enjoy about it. My guess is that a lot of people get a sense of adventure from this that we just don't get.
Right.
For me, the mechanics get in the way of that. If you can see past what we see are mechanical flaws here, if you think that the randomness wouldn't be such a big deal for you and the fiddliness wouldn't bother you, obviously a lot of people are playing this and getting sucked into it. It's just not for us. So that's all for us this episode. If you haven't yet, you can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Solosaurus. You can also find us on Instagram at Solosaurus Podcast, where we post pictures regularly of things that we're playing or maybe things that we get in the mail, new games into our library, that sort of thing. Check us out on there. You can also send us an email if you have any comments or questions about the show. You can email us at solosaurus@gmail.com. And if you haven't yet, go on iTunes, write us a review, rate our podcast. The more of that you do, the easier it is for people to find us and the more we can do with the show. But until next time, my name is Brandon Waite.
My name is Carter Mackey.
And this is Solosaurus.